1780s, slavery was starting to fade away, but the invention of the cotton prompted plantation owners to keep their slaves to support the larger cotton harvest. The South was more of an oligarchy. The government was heavily impacted by the planters' aristocracy. The Southern aristocracy widened the gap between the poor people and the rich. Which of the following from smallest to the largest is the white population of the South? The answer is first, the rich slave owners, and then the relatively poor slave owners. Those people, they don't have majority of slaves, but they have some of them. And then it's a long slave holding whites, and takes about 3/4 of the South population. And those whites, they support slavery because they wanted to eventually get slaves and achieve the so-called American dream of moving up to the upper society. And then the less prosperous non-slave holding whites are poor white trash. In a civilization that hadn't reached mountain whites who live in the valley of the Appalachian Range. And they finally supported Abraham Lincoln's Union Party. Regions of the South where most slaves were concentrated called Black Belt, and then stretched from South Carolina to Alabama to Mississippi. The Second Great Awakening sparks a lot of early abolitionism, and inspired many abolitionists to speak out against the issues of slavery. There was a guy called Theodore Dwight Wild, and he was famous for as an abolitionist who spoke against the issue of slavery, and he wrote the well-known pamphlet called American Slavery as It Is in 1839 that made the arguments against slavery on the top of the discussing issue. Frederick Douglass, he was a black abolitionist who speak for against the abolitionism, and he looked to the politics in order to end this issue of slavery, and he published his autobiography called Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, and became a famous abolitionist. Sojourner Truth, a freed black woman who fought for black emancipation and the rights of the woman. From 1833 to 32, Virginia defeated numerous emancipation bills, and others follows, and is known as the Nullification Crisis of 1832.
That prohibit any forms of emancipation of slavery.
The gag resolution required that all of the anti-slavery appeals to be tabled without any debate in the House of the Representatives.
Right now, how about we bring up some issues of slavery?
No, we cannot talk about any slavery issue in the House of Representatives.
In 1835, the government ordered that the Southern postmasters they have to destroy the abolition materials due to the anti-abolitionist robbing, and noting that a postal office in Charleston, South Carolina.
Show me all of your abolitionist documents. For the sake of the anti-slavery purposes, I want you to destroy all of the documents in front of my eyes.
Many people in the North, especially those manufacturers, they're not supportive of anti-slavery.
Gold is an important resource of my income, and I will not take my money from the bank if the war starts.
Democrats nominates James Polk won the election of 1844.
James Polk, as President of the United States, I will protect Texas and avoid slavery issue in this state.
Polk wanted California to be peaceful, and he hoped that America could pull off the war with California. And there are some American generals involved in Mexican wars.
This is General Stephen W. Kearny. This is General Winfield Scott.
This is General Zachary Taylor.
The war against Mexico provided field experience for officials who became the greatest generals in the Civil War later, including Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Ulysses Grant.
David Wilson. In a proposed amendment that Texas, a territory from Mexico, should remain slave-free. official from Northern Territory, and they proposed the popular sovereignty, which means the issue of the slavery must be dealt by the people. So the people of the territory will decide the issue of the slavery. I'm an official from California, and today we bypassed the Constitution of California and exclude the issue of slavery in California state. And we submit our request to Congress to join the union.
As a Southerner senator, I object your request because this will unbalance the seats in the Senate of North and South.
As a government official from the South, I sincerely state that the South has already bypassed the fugitive slave law to replace the one that was passed by Congress in 1793.
The congressional debate of 1850 was called for to address the admission of California to the Union and the threat of secession by the Southern Territory.
Compromiser.
I propose to enact the stricter fugitive slave law in North.
I, President Zachary Taylor, oppose slavery and oppose any compromises between the North and the South.
Speaking of slavery, California was accepted as a free state. However, New Mexico and Utah were open to popular sovereignty. In addition, slave trade was outlawed in District of Columbia, but a stricter fugitive law was enacted. During the second era of the Good Feeling, the discussion of secession was mitigated, and the Northern and Southern were determined the compromise would end the issue. Because the compromise of 1850 allowed California and Mexico-Utah territory to be free, the Senate became unbalanced in favor of the North. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 said the fleeing slave could not be testified on their behalf, and they were denied by a jury trial. Northerners who held a slave trying to escape were subject to fine and jail time. The law was the South's only real gain after Oregon and California were acquired. The Transcontinental Railroad was proposed and about to be built. The open question was where to put the railroad's terminus. Is it in the north or the south? The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 authorized the Union Pacific Road and the Central Pacific Road to build a railroad and a telegraph line beginning in Omaha, Nebraska, and ending in Sacramento, California. The act also provided land from the public domain and government bonds to help pay for the construction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act conflicted with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that forbade the slavery in the proposed Nebraska Territory. Douglas was forced to propose the repealing of the Missouri Compromises. President Pierce fully supported the Kansas-Nebraska bill.
I, Stephen Douglas, proposed that the territory of Nebraska should be sliced into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And the people there can decide to be a free slave state or slave state by popular sovereignty.
The Kansas Territory robbery violence in 1855 between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery factions. In 1857, the Supreme Court Judge Scott's decision permitted slavery in all Western territories, invalidating the Missouri Compromise. The New England Immigrant Aid Company, a group of abolitionists, paid some people to move to Kansas to make it a free state. The Kansas and Nebraska territories had popular sovereignty in choosing the slavery, according to Kansas-Nebraska Act. Judge Scott, a slave who had lived with his master for 5 years in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, and he sued for his freedom on the basis of his long residence on free soil. In Judge Scott versus Stanford, the 15th Amendment forbade the Congress from depriving people of their property without the due process of the law. However, the court ruled that the Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, and the Congress had to follow the slavery rule, regardless of what they wanted. Therefore, the decision was Judge Scott was a slave, and he was a private property. Thus, he could be taken into any territory and legally held there in slavery. Lincoln versus Douglas. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates that ranged from August to October in 1858. Their and the most famous debate happened in Freeport, Illinois.
Territory vote on slavery.
The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, has said that people could not do this. But in my opinion, slavery should stay down if people voted on it.
The Republican Party met in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. The Republican platform was spread nearly every part of the country. For the manufacturers, they said for the protection. For the immigrants, they said they should have the equal rights. For the northwest part of the nation, they supported the Pacific Railroad. And for the West, they supported internal improvement at the federal expenses. The Southerners said that if Abraham Lincoln was elected as a president, the Union was split. Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, but he did not win the popular vote. Nearly 60% of the nation's vote was for another candidate. 10,000 states didn't even allow Lincoln to appear on the ballot. South Carolina was happy at the outcome of the election because it now had a reason to secede from the Union. Even though the Republicans won the presidential election, they did not control the House of Representatives, the Senate, or even the Supreme Court.
1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union because Lincoln became the president, and they unanimously passed the secession from the Union. And later on, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all followed the path of the South Carolina, and they quit the Union. And in 1861, the Confederate States of America was formed.
President Abraham Lincoln declared that secession was impractical because the North and South were not geographically divided. He also stated that with secession, new controversies could arise, including the federal territories, fugitive slave issues, and national debt. When President Lincoln was elected, there were only two significant forts in the South and flew the Union's flag. Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor needed supply in order to supply its men. Hence, Lincoln adopted a middle way. He told the South that North was going to send provision to the fort, not the supplies of the reinforcement, such as guns. Now, taking Lincoln's solution as aggression, South Carolina fired Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861.